Welcome, I'm Sarah D.
I'm Dr. D.
And my husband has a PhD in economics, and his field, his specialization
Is game theory.
Yes, his dissertation was in game theory. And when he moved to his current position, he didn't get to move forward in that much. He had to do something else because in the game of life, you don't get to choose everything that happens. You have to make it work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the game of life, there are only two players, we could say. Could we say that?
It's a way to think about it. Yes, it's a simplification, but it's a way to think about it.
So that's what we're going to do today, I believe.
Yeah, we are going to simplify.
We're going to simplify it because we were getting a little deep last week. I was getting pretty confused.
With absolute advantage.
With absolute advantage,
Yes.
yeah.
And we could have gone forward with comparative advantage.
Yeah.
And been even more
confused.
Yes.
We started talking about that and we decided, let's talk about games because game theory is his, what do they call it? Joe? No, his mojo? Yeah. His expertise. So I said something to him about something that happened in Texas. And I don't usually look at the news that much, but for some reason I caught the horrible thing that happened in Texas in the grade school. And it makes me cry if I think about it too much.
So that's one thing we're going to talk about?
We're not going to talk about that,
okay,
but just that in that.
That would make me cry too.
Yeah, I know. We have to figure out. The thing is, because in game theory, whenever something does come up in the news, I think, oh, Dean, he has the answer. He has the answer. I know he has the answer. Because I know I have a lot of faith in the game theoretic network. Network?
Structure, thank
you. And so in that particular thing, there were two players. The one who was doing the danger, the killing.
The shooter.
The shooter.
Active shooter.
Yeah. And everybody else. That's how I was looking at it. And so we're going to talk about games as in two players. Two-player games.
There aren't technically two players, but we're going to think about, yes. It's a multiplayer game with two types of players.
And eventually we're gonna share a potential solution for that. And that's kind of where this came from. So two players.
Two players, two types of players.
Two types of players.
Yeah. So oftentimes people complain about what we call the free market capitalist system because it generates outcomes that are unbalanced.
Right, it's not fair.
Could be not fair, at least unbalanced.
I hear it's not
Sometimes
fair.
it's not fair, but let's just say unbalanced. That is that we don't end up with people getting similar outcomes.
Right.
And so the question is, why is it that we have a system that we call, let's just call it...
Democracy?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
We're starting with our economic system, which is free market capitalism.
Okay.
And we call it free market capitalism for a couple of reasons, right? So the biggest reason is that the individual is allowed to make their own decisions.
So the individual has the freedom to make their own decision, not that there's no cost to being in the marketplace.
That's right. The individual
Okay.
has the right to make decisions, right? So it's not the company that makes decisions. It's not the demand side that makes decisions. It's not the supply side that makes decisions. It's individuals. So individuals have the right to make decisions. So I get to choose whether I'm going to purchase broccoli or cauliflower. And farmers get to decide whether they're going to plant and grow broccoli or cauliflower.
Yes.
Right, so the producer is allowed to make their own decisions, and I'm allowed to make my own decision.
I think that sounds, if we're going back to the fair, I think that sounds very fair.
And those decisions then enter into this game, we call it a marketplace, and outcomes are resolved. I buy a certain amount of broccoli or cauliflower, the farmer sells a certain amount of broccoli or cauliflower, everybody gets...
When you say resolved, do you mean like results?
Yeah, results.
Not as in there was a problem, although there are problems involved, but you meant like results.
Well, there is a problem, right? So there's a farmer with a bunch of broccoli and cauliflower that will just rot. and there's me starving to death, that sounds like a problem.
Okay. I missed that part.
Why would I buy the broccoli or cauliflower?
Because you
wanted to eat it.
You want to eat trees.
Yeah, I want to eat broccoli and cauliflower. And why does the farmer grow broccoli and cauliflower?
Because, well, I think it's because they're thinking about there's a demand for it, maybe.
But why are they selling it?
Well,
Right, they produce it to sell it, not to store it in their silo.
That's true. That's true. Why would they sell it?
Yeah.
Because they need the money to use for exchange for the
Ooh,
gasoline that they want to put in their car.
Our absolute advantage thing. Right, exactly. That's exactly right. They're making broccoli and cauliflower. I'm making something else. We're exchanging dollars back and forth. They get the gasoline that I produce. I get the broccoli and cauliflower that they produce, and we get to trade that. And the funny thing is that what happens when we play that game? Because I specialized and they specialized.
Right. You mean the curious thing?
The curious thing that happened.
Okay, sorry, I was laughing. I don't know.
Well,
Help me.
I got more broccoli and cauliflower than I would have done if I made it myself.
Right, because you're not very good at it.
They got more gasoline than they would have got.
Because they don't have skill there.
So we're both better off.
You're both better off because of the exchange and because we used the cash, the money, to make the exchange. We don't have to do barter, which is passe.
Passe, right. Slows everything down. So the deal is that I could have made broccoli and cauliflower myself. The farmer could have, and gasoline. The farmer could have made broccoli and cauliflower and gasoline by themselves, and we all would have had less. We engaged in this and we exchanged, and maybe I win more than the farmer wins, or the farmer wins more than I win. That's what generates these unequal results, right? Somebody won the game. Both of us won the game, but maybe one of us won by more than the other, right? So that's.
So the game is the marketplace.
The game is the marketplace, and
because we wouldn't have that game if I made it all myself and you made it all yourself.
And we use this thing. We talked about this thing that we use called money. Mm-hmm. Where does money come from?
Trust.
Trust, yes, but who prints it? Are you allowed to print
it?
I
got the right answer.
You're right.
What did you say?
Were you allowed to print the money?
No, I'm not, because we have a system that works already, so why would I print it?
Yeah, we have this thing called a government.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the game that we're going to talk about, right? So in order for our market game to work well, it's really nice if there's money. But money is a social construct. It's a social construct that all of us agree to. It's a community construct. The community agrees what money is. And then it becomes something that can be used. But there has to be a community, otherwise there's no money, otherwise there's only barter.
So it had to be really hard to start it that way, right?
Well,
it's pretty rough.
But we had communities already.
Okay.
Right? So we already had communities. And so the question is, what is this interaction, this fundamental way that we conceptualize or conceive how communities and individuals interact?
I didn't read the chapter very well.
Okay, there are only two ways that we can think about it.
Oh, the us and them?
Well, we can think of us and them, but there are only two ways we can think of how we, the individual, and them or that, the society, interact.
There's only two ways we can think about it.
Yeah. So what are the two ways we think of, what's the way we think about it here in the United States? Who is the government? How does the government come to be?
We vote them in.
Okay. So we have this thing called the Constitution, right? And this Constitution determined that we vote in the government.
Right.
But what is it that we're giving up, right? As individuals, we gave something up to have a government. Yeah. But we got something in exchange for it.
Right.
So what was the fundamental conceptual framework on which the Constitution was built?
Well, it was built on the framework that the individual is sovereign. Right?
And the government serves
the individual.
Serves the people, right? So that's one way we can conceptualize let's say, a nation or a state or a community or whatever you want to call this aggregation, this social unit.
Right.
So we've decided here in the United States, and it was a huge experiment, not a new experiment, but a huge experiment that was engaged in 1776.
Right, because before that they had kings.
Yeah, so we moved to a very different concept. We moved to a concept where the government was granted rights by the people. And all of the rights that weren't granted to the government were retained by
the people.
The people, right? So the people were sovereign, and the government was given
specific things
that it did in service of
right.
the people.
And the people.
Right? So that's the fundamental conceptualization of the game that we play here in the United States.
The government?
Police officers are one of the things that we ceded to government in order, right? So, and we can talk about that in depth, but it's not meaningful for what we're doing today.
I know, I'm good.
Yeah. Okay. So then you mentioned kings. How did a kingdom work?
Well, the king was sovereign, and the individuals were subservient to the king.
That's right. Beautiful. So really, there's only two ways that we've thought of organizing society.
There's never been another way that we've done.
Not one that I can think of that is in existence.
Right.
Right. So one way is society somehow is sovereign, whether it's a king or it doesn't have to be a king. It could be a dictator. It could be a people's republic, like in communist countries. But we've got this government that is sovereign. The community is sovereign, and the individual is subservient to the community.
The community of the government.
Well,
or whatever.
it doesn't have to be right. So government is right.
Yeah, the community. Okay.
The community is sovereign. However you choose to organize the community, it's sovereign, and the individuals are subservient to it. Or the individuals are sovereign, and the community is subservient to them. It meets their needs. So there's two ways. The people are sovereign, and the government serves the people. The government is sovereign, and the people serve the government. Those are the two ways that we have conceptualized.
In ours, do we serve each other or not?
Well,
maybe
in the sense of serving each other, what's the problem with me serving someone I don't know?
You don't know what they want.
Right. So there's no way for me to so the story of everybody serving each other is not doable.
Well, that's like Imagine All the People, that song.
Yeah, right. But it's not doable because none of us have the information or knowledge to do that.
Because we're not omniscient.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I mean, potentially a god could do it.
Right, and that's what Plato basically said.
So yeah. So we look at exactly Socrates. Plato wrote The Republic, but the protagonist in the book is Socrates. And Socrates comes up with this solution, right? He thinks that democracy is foolish and not useful. He sees the flaws in democracy, and his solution is what?
A king, poet?
Philosopher.
A
philosopher king, right? So he says we need to set up a structure where we train those who will lead us, those who will be sovereign. We train them
from their
babyhood to be of the appropriate temperament
from their parents,
right?
Even, right?
To be of the appropriate temperament to be leaders of the people, right? So we generate the angels that will be sovereign over us, right? And so his critique of democracy is that, well, the right answer is we just need to design gods and grow them from babyhood and make them. And, oh, by the way, that was well discussed by the Catholic Church in early Europe with something called the divine right of kings. Technically, the king was kissed by God and given what was necessary, and the Pope, blessed the king, and that now the king was working in the interests of the people. So we had no wars in medieval Europe, or
Absolutely.
we had no,
and everybody had everything.
Everything they needed, and everything worked out just perfectly, right? Because it was.
We had the philosopher king, essentially.
We had the philosopher king. But in 1776, there was this whole new concept that came along, and that concept was going back to the democracy, or the concept of democracy that Plato talked about, or that Plato lived in Athens.
Oh, they had the individual sovereign?
Ish. The appropriate individuals were sovereign.
Oh, those who were actually citizens.
Right. So
we've enlarged it from there.
Oh, we've enlarged it.
Because we say everyone's sovereign.
Everyone is sovereign, even if they're not a citizen.
Right.
They are sovereign. Right? They just don't have the right to vote. They don't have all of the rights.
Right.
But they still have the right to choose whether they want broccoli or cauliflower.
Yep.
Right? And so that concept of the individual being sovereign. So with that idea coming out in 1776, there was a whole nother idea that was published in a book called The Wealth of Nations.
Mm-hmm. Adam Smith.
Adam Smith. And he's the father of our understanding of how our market systems work. He didn't understand it perfectly, but he was the father of that, of the thought process of getting into understanding how marketplaces worked and how the market worked. And he was critical of kings that intervened and decided what you and I should be allowed to buy, and kings that intervened in the marketplace and decided what you and I should be allowed to sell. Right? Because kings did that because they were sovereign. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that. When society is sovereign over the individual, society decides what's good for you. And if you don't have something restricting society, even in democracy, if you don't have something restricting what society can decide, democracy quickly turns into a totalitarian state of the majority. So democracy doesn't give you individual sovereignty either.
Yeah, all by itself. It
does not.
Rule.
It becomes mob rule, which is not, again, not a source.
So we are not a democracy.
We are not a perfect democracy. We're not a pure democracy.
Right.
No, we are a republic, and we're a representative democracy. But more importantly, we have constitutionally restricted the government to being subservient to the individuals, to the people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a very important thing, right? Who's in service to who? Right. Are the people in service to the government, or is the government in service to the people? That's the fundamental difference. So in the early 20th century, well, actually in the late 19th century, there was this gentleman by the name of Karl Marx who looked at, some of the shortcomings of the capitalist
He's the
market
Imagine All
system.
The People guy, right?
He's started Imagine All the People, yes.
Yeah.
And so he talked about there were a whole movement of of socialist utopians. Most of them coming out from underneath of some form of Christianity. So they were actually Christian utopians. Karl Marx was not.
Right.
But he took the information from these utopians and he decided that there was an idealized world where, falling back to somebody by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where there was a knowable social will. Society knew what was best for each of the individuals.
Well, I think it would be best if everybody wore deodorant. Sorry.
No, exactly, right? And because there was this knowable social will, there was a way to organize individual behavior. That is, the society could organize individual behavior so that the individuals would maximize or achieve the social will.
Basically, that's kind of what parents try to do.
Yes, exactly. Fail miserably at it.
I know. I mean, not because our children end up bad, but because we
don't know.
Do it wrong.
Yeah. And so that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so
But we mean well.
So he he postulated this system that was called communism. And he spoke about the flaws in the capitalist system and the move towards this socially determined outcome where the people were subservient to society. And we developed all sorts of experiments in it. Soviet Union was, or Russia, then the Soviet Union was a great example of it. China was another great example of it under Mao. And there's several others, but those are the two big examples, and we can think about those. The problem with those is the philosopher king issue.
Yeah, they never found him.
No, it's hard to find the person who knows the social will. And what is it that justifies...
Will or welfare, even, right?
Who is it that knows that, and how do you know you found the right person? So, how do you name the Dalai Lama that knows the societal will? How do you know the God on earth? Is the God on earth the person with the biggest guns, or that can organize the most people and subjugate the most easily, right? Which is exactly the way those have tended, right? So when we talk about the millions that died under Mao and the millions that died under Stalin and all of these kinds of things, that's exactly what this social will was. Clearly the will of Stalin, or the will of Mao, or the will of Deng Xiaoping, or we can talk about the will of Gorbachev, or the will of, right? So we can talk about this. Became the person's will, became the will of the people, and then they made society subservient to their vision.
By force.
By whatever means necessary, right? Because they had the social will. And if you were deviant from the social will, clearly it was because you didn't want good for society. And you were too selfish, and you were willing to take the good for you and sacrifice good
Some
for
people
society.
say that's what we do in our
That's exactly what we do, right? So that's
what?
Yeah, it's exactly what we do. Your personal will is sovereign up to the points that we have ceded to the government.
But some people say that the market is not fair.
No, it's not fair. There is no fairness in this, depending upon what you mean by fairness. And we've discussed this one before, right? Yeah. It's not equal in distribution. But that doesn't mean it's not fair. There are other measurements of fair. But anyway, so the point is that those are the issues. And so the new social experiment is democracy.
And people are talking about that we should go to communism or socialism.
But that's the old, right? Communism.
Like some new world order.
It's not. You're right. So it's not a new world order. It's the old world order, right? We just replaced, emperor with party chairman, and we've just replaced dictator with.
So it's the same game.
It's the exact same game. We just changed the names of the people in it. And the only difference between the games, right, the way to distinguish the games is who's sovereign and who is subservient.
So when the individual is sovereign, then the individual has more control. They don't control gravity, but they do control what is possible for an individual to control.
Absolutely.
Given the constraints they allowed the governing entity to have over them.
Exactly. So we gave up being able to print our own money. You and I can't write our own money. We gave that right up to the government.
Right.
And now we have a stable currency that works well for exchange.
Right, it is stable.
Yeah, it is. It's very stable.
It's only gone up a little bit. Inflation or something recently?
Only recently, yes. And so those are things that we've done, and we've done those things. So that the game we play, if I am to be sovereign, the game that can be played as far as the marketplace goes has to be market competition and capitalism.
Because if the government is making those decisions, you are no longer sovereign, because you
by definition, I'm no longer
you may be allergic to broccoli, and the government says, no, you have to have this much broccoli.
Right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You can't have individual sovereignty and a non-market system. The more you control the market system, the more you regulate the market system, the more you make the government in charge of the market system, the more you believe that there is a person or a committee that knows the social will, the more subservient you make the individual to the governing center.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. That's the trade-off.
Nobody knows how many pencils to make each year.
No.
People just make them in the market.
Yeah, and the right amount is made.
Well, and if it's not, well, yeah, the prices go up or down. Yeah, yeah.
But the fundamental point here is that if I control the market, the individuals in the market are now subservient to whatever the control is. And now society has its outcome that it wants, and the individual is subservient. I've moved the sovereignty.
I like that one. I mean, I don't always like it, but
Yeah,
it
the
beats
question
the
is,
alternative.
where are we sovereign? And the best example of trying to keep a quasi-market system where the individual was not sovereign is fascism. Or Nazi Germany is a great example of it. Right?
Because that's when the government owns everything and
No, they don't own everything.
well, they just tell you what to do with it.
They tell you what to do with it.
Yeah.
They tell you what to do with it.
Communism is when they own everything.
Yeah. Well, socialism is when they own everything. Communism is when society as a whole owns everything. How that's different from the government owning anything is subtle.
Because that's confusing.
That's the problem with Marx. He never described what was in control.
Did we make a point?
I think we made a point.
You encapsulate the point because
The point that we made was pretty straightforward. Who is sovereign?
and who do you want to be sovereign?
Who do you want to be sovereign? Here in the United States, we have decided the individual is sovereign, and we've ceded a few rights to the governing structures.
And so if there's issues that we see with the governing structures, there are mechanisms in place and we can massage them in the little areas that we can massage them in, but trying to overthrow and just start over with
You want to make
the
sure that
government being sovereign or some other
you-
individual who would end up being the government, the king. That's a mess. It's been done. It's played out. It's old. What we have is the best there is to have. But if you don't like the way it is, then you as an individual can find the mechanisms within the organization that exists.
Yeah.
And just in little places, do what you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because you're sovereign.
Because you're sovereign and you can do that. You can't determine all the results.
Because not all of your friends agree with you.
No, they don't. No, they don't. Sometimes you lose friends.
Sometimes you lose friends doing it. That's right.
We want to thank you for joining us for this economic conversation about
A game theoretic structure.
Yeah, game
Two
theoretic.
fundamental concepts of how to structure the game of the economy in general.
Thank you, Dr. D. I'm Sarah D. Thank you for joining us.
I'm Dr. D. Namaste.
Make it a great day.